Am I the only one that's had kind of difficult times trying to understand this story? You, and what's bothered you as you've approached this over years?
Well, just let the children eat all they want. Well, it's not right to take the children's bread. It doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't sound like Jesus. Anybody else have any observations or any feelings that they've had over the years as they've studied this?
Me, it kind of seemed to me like another example of Jesus always had his timing. So she's desperate to have her daughter healed. He's kind of, well, let's let the other kids eat. Only because Jesus had the omnipotent knowledge of knowing everything will be fine. The woman does it. She's like, sooner the better my child's suffering. He's like, let the kids eat. And so her persistence was like, well, dogs go get the crumbs, everybody will eat. And just in that very moment, she believed in him and that her faith in him, and then it was done. I think sometimes I get so tied up in the details, it distracts me and it makes me overthink it. But when I look at that passage for myself, just got kind of back to Jesus' perfect timing all.
She didn't argue.
She didn't argue.
No, after he said, let the children have their, she said yes. I mean, it wasn't an ongoing argument. When I reread it, and I haven't read this so many times, is that then said, because of your answer, you may go.
Well, isn't the, I mean, I don't know about the context here, but the, isn't it the Jew versus the non-Jew thing? And she just happened to be totally on the money and responded exactly correct.
That's part of it. So, well, let's get started. So Jesus is traveling up into Tyre. Tyre, has anyone ever been to, what is the current Tyre would be in Lebanon?
South Lebanon.
South Lebanon. Has anybody ever been in southern Lebanon? Well, we're kind of used to, at least borders do change, but there are borders between Lebanon and Israel and Syria and Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so forth, Jordan. But at this time, there weren't these clear-cut boundaries, and especially not for civilization. So like I've tried to explain in the past, Jesus in Galilee was really close, walking distance, to about 10 Greek towns, which were called the Decapolis. And so the intermixture of these cultures is something that we need to be aware of, and especially in talking about, like Ken was saying, the relationship between the Jews and everybody else. So Tyre extended down at this time into Upper Galilee. Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus went up into this Greek or Syrophoenician area, or why he wishes to remain incognito. What does he say? He says, he entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Mark doesn't get bogged down by telling us why, but his presence can't be kept secret for long. And remember, at this time, Jesus' reputation has been spreading by word of mouth rapidly. And so he couldn't keep it secret long, even in this predominantly Gentile area, even though almost all of his ministry thus far has been just among the Jews. When this Gentile woman with a daughter who's plagued with some kind of unclean spirit finds out that he's nearby, she immediately seeks Jesus out. Mark says she's a Greek. She speaks. So let's imagine her as speaking Greek, and that she's a Syrophoenician. we haven't heard much about the Phoenicians since early in the Old Testament, but what were the Phoenicians known for? This is just an aside. This doesn't, what? They were sea people, right? They were accomplished sailors. They lived right around the coast there in Tyre and the areas of Tyre and Sidon. The Old Testament presents Tyre as a wealthy but godless city. So when the Canaanites and the Jews and the Syrophoenicians were all being kind of intermixed and encountering each other in various times in the Old Testament, what we know about the people from Tyre is that we're considered to be wealthy, but and that's probably because of all their trade. But they were also considered to be godless. And over the years, in the Old Testament times, they oppressed the Jews. So they were a dominant culture. Remember, the Jewish kingdom was only really a power during what period of time? David, during the King David's and King Solomon, right? And most every other time in the Old Testament and definitely in the New Testament, they were the oppressed people or the underclass people, or they were carried off into slavery when they were conquered by the Babylonians. They were carried off into slavery when they were captured and overcome by the Assyrians. So most of their time, they are an oppressed people, looked down upon by the surrounding cultures. Jews, though, in the first century, accepted without question that Gentiles, and Gentiles is not an ethnic group, Gentiles is just a term which refers to anybody other than a Jew. So, Jewish people believed that Gentiles were impure simply because they were not Jewish. So here we are expecting Jesus to be gracious to this lady, right? We expect Jesus to always be gracious, just as he was to the unclean outcasts within the Jewish nation. Remember, the last few weeks we've been studying about who was he gracious to that other people wouldn't be gracious to. The what? The lepers, yeah. And various people who the religious establishment would consider to be sinners, impure. We expect Jesus to be kind and loving and gracious, and this doesn't seem to be what we're expecting. We're surprised that Jesus isn't as affable as we would expect. Look at verse 27. It says, "First, let the children eat all they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." What's he calling her there? A dog. And dogs weren't as pampered as Shelby's dogs are, by the way, in those day and age. Dogs kind of had to make it on their own and weren't fed 3 square meals a day and so forth and so on. The word first, when he says first, let the children. The word first implies that Gentiles do have a ray of hope for some kind of food. But for the time being, he's saying this woman must wait her turn. As Paul says, the good news is first for the Jew, then for the Gentiles. He says that in Romans twice. Jesus is coming as the Messiah. Hi, Linda, come on in. Good to see you. Jesus is coming as the Messiah, the awaited one, the one who's going to rescue them from their downtroddenness, they're expecting them, the Messiah, to free them from the Roman oppression. The Romans, remember, it was the Greeks first, now it's the Romans in terms of the political power. But the Jews expected the Messiah to come first to Israel, and this woman has no right to jump the line, so to speak, to break in front of anybody else. So the second surprise that we have is that this woman is unwilling to be put off by this less than genial response. She's expecting Jesus to at least be kind in his response, but she's not put off. She accepts his premise that the children, the Israelites, the Jews, are to be fed first before the dogs get anything. And how does she respond? She responds kind of with a quick wit. And she answers Jesus' riddle immediately. She recognizes that the children represent Israel and the dogs represent Gentiles. Israel, even though they were always downtrodden, they were always poorer, except for this time during David and Solomon, they were economically poorer than these wealthier trading areas along the Mediterranean, like Tyre. And nevertheless, they understood themselves to be the children of God, of Yahweh. And they themselves, even though they were politically downtrodden, they were socially looked down upon, they themselves looked down upon everybody else. Most expressed scorn for the unclean, idolatrous Gentiles by calling them dogs. So, and remember, a Jew wouldn't, not even, if you're an observant Jew, you wouldn't be going to have dinner in a Gentile's house. Remember, what did they do when they left a Gentile town? They shook the dust off their feet, right? And they would even avoid going into Samaria completely, even though going through Samaria was the quickest way to travel to Jerusalem from a lot of areas. So the woman accepts Jesus' interpretation of this riddle. She accepts that Israel takes precedence and that the time for Gentiles to come and be healed, or Gentiles to become and be saved, hasn't come yet. The woman isn't angry at what we would probably feel as an insult. She doesn't worry that someone else, namely the Jews, would have an advantage with Jesus. And she refuses, she is cheerfully refusing, kind of with tongue in cheek, she's cheerfully refusing to accept his answer. She won't take no for an answer. She accepts the role of being a dog, And she comes begging for food. Even a crumb. She understands more about the bread that Jesus offers than even his disciples do. Let me read for you from the next chapter, chapter 8, verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? What has he just done? When I broke the loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And they answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? So this woman understands better than his own disciples at this point in his ministry. She begs to receive only the crumbs. She knows that she cannot presume on God's mercy, and she doesn't take offense. She will gladly accept being called a dog, even being considered a dog, if it means being fed. And of course, as moms, you all are thinking, and if her daughter can only get healed. Well, Jesus relents and he grants her request. She desperately wants healing for her daughter. And she'll go to great lengths, even being insulted, to get it. And she accepts Jesus' priority of feeding the Jews first. So she's a disciple. What does she have that we need as a disciple? Well, let's begin with, Okay, well, what about humility? To humble oneself. That's what we're going to talk about today. To humble oneself is a key requirement for a disciple. The disciples themselves are having trouble receiving the kingdom as children. When we get to chapter 10, verse 15, what did the people were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. And he took the children in his arms, he placed his hands on them, and he blessed them.
Bill,
Yeah.
that sounds like Jesus.
That sounds like Jesus.
This doesn't.
Okay. She's what?
No. It needs,
Oh, the Jews, that the other people were dogs?
yeah, it needs a couple more sentences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this woman has no problem receiving Jesus' gift, receiving the kingdom of God as a little dog. She's willing to take whatever he'll give her, the crumbs. When Jesus says that the demon has left her daughter, now what would you have thought that what would you have said? You would have, okay, think about this. What I might have said is, wait a minute, come
How'd you do?
come with me and let's make sure about this. She doesn't insist that Jesus come and make double sure that the demon's gone. She goes in faith. He says, the demon's gone. She goes in faith, just like she came in faith, assuming he could do it. So the implication of this story is that God will heal Gentiles no matter how far away from God they might seem. Remember, she doesn't even have the same God. She's a Syrophoenician woman, probably with a panoply of Greek and Roman gods. The predominant culture around her. But she definitely doesn't have Yahweh as her God. She hasn't converted to Judaism. But the implication of the story is that God's going to heal Gentiles. So, and here's where I want to bring it home to us. Being of the wrong race, the wrong nationality, the wrong social class, even the wrong religious background, does not prevent one from receiving God's healing, because those who possess a humble faith will be fed. So we're offended a little bit by this gruff reaction that Jesus seems to have to this desperate woman, this desperate mother that's been bothered with this affliction with her daughter for many years. Why does he seem to be so surly when she pleads for her daughter? I mean, if we had a lady who we had never seen before wander into the church on Sunday morning and come up and say to Jack, please come help my daughter, what are we going to expect his reaction to be? To go, right? Yeah, I mean, glad to help you. Come on in, lady. We're nice to see you. We're glad to see you here. We're welcoming to all, right? But she comes asking, she comes seeking, she comes knocking at the door. Why does he speak about throwing bread to dogs? He seems to say that the only legitimate recipients of his grace are members of Israel, Jews. If you're honest, this scene upsets your sense of justice, doesn't it? And why isn't Jesus more sensitive to her cry for help? She can't help that she's been born a Gentile. She can't help that she lives in Tyre. We don't mind Jesus being rude to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, right? We don't mind him being rude to them. We believe that they deserve it. But gosh, this seems to be like Jesus, to be rude to this hurting mother who's just there begging for help. So naturally, and I don't know about you, and all of us are, except for Adrian, of a certain generation, and Wayne over here, he's still young. My buddy Jim's still young. But you've all encountered this story a number of times. Maybe you've been taught this story in Sunday school. Maybe your Sunday school avoided this story. But many people have tried to sugarcoat this story and to sugarcoat Jesus's language. Here's some ways some different commentators have sugarcoated this. One said This is a half humorous tenderness of manner. That sounds like something from the late 19th century. Somebody said, he said it with a twinkle in his eye. Here's one Shelby will like. The word that was translated dog means it actually was a pampered pet, not a street cur. Okay, or perhaps it shows Jesus' own struggle with the scope of his mission. Maybe he didn't even understand that he was supposed to save the world at this point in his ministry. Perhaps he, at this point in his ministry, believed that his ministry was limited to Israel. That sounds like a very, to me, early 20th century, very liberal interpretation of the scripture. Or perhaps Jesus temporarily withholds his help to test her faith. And this is what Calvin said. The reason I'm bringing back Calvin into it is he is kind of the father of our branch of this large kingdom of the church. Calvin said, Jesus said this, quote, to whet her zeal and to inflame her faith, to encourage her to make a more strenuous effort at faith. Here's another one. This episode is fundamentally about crossing boundaries. The power of the kingdom cannot be limited to a narrow domain of Israel, but will encompass all people. Here's another interpretation. His harsh reaction is indicative of the socioeconomic relations between Tyre and Sidon. Tyre was well stocked with food, which was primarily produced in Galilee, whereas those who grew the food, namely the Israelites, were frequently hungry. That sounds like a social struggle we would have today here, right? I mean, like Jan's always talking about, not always talking about, I enjoy when she talks about her growing up in the valley where her dad, I think, was a itinerant farm worker. Where'd she grow up? Somewhere near El Centro, I think.
You got a hand raised.
Oh, Linda.
To add to what you said, perhaps Jesus felt that his mission was to lift up the Israelites as a primary goal because they were persecuted for years. He was trying to even the playing field, and so his priority was Israel and less so the Gentiles. And so he's distracting the mission.
Okay, so let's talk. We're going to talk about this because I think it's going to help you confront some of your own. All of us confront some of our own issues here. Josephus, I've told you who Josephus was. Does anybody remember who Josephus was? He was considered the greatest Jewish historian of this time. He wasn't a Christian. He was a Jewish historian. He said, Tyre are our bitterest enemies. So therefore, this woman is a Gentile member of a resented class of privileged foes. So she's not the underdog here socially or economically. She's coming from a wealthier socioeconomic situation.
She kept asking, does that mean she was kind of a pushy woman?
I am not going to comment on those words. Okay, Mark isn't offended by Jesus's remarks, okay? We assume that Jesus is obligated. We assume that Jesus is obligated to respond to every request to heal everyone, right? I mean, why didn't he just heal everybody on the earth while he's here? Our prejudice is that Gentiles, because all of us are one, I think. I don't know. Is anybody here of a Jewish background? Or if they are, they probably aren't from this type of attitude towards non-Jews, or they might not be here at the church. But our prejudice is that Gentiles are just as important as Jews. Even more so. Because we know that most Jews will reject him, and many Gentiles will accept him. In fact, we're a little bit offended by the particularity of God's election. I mean, one of the questions we're always asking is, why does God elect Jim and not somebody else? Right? So, okay, now, this is going to get uncomfortable for us in a minute here. Jesus is deliberately scandalous here. He affronts the Pharisees by calling them hypocrites, his own people, right? The establishment. He calls the Pharisees hypocrites. He scoffs at their tradition. He insults this woman, a Gentile, by calling her a dog. Here's the question to ask yourself. How would you have responded if you were this woman? I mean, to be honest with you, if it was me, yeah.
Nationality they are, race they are, whatever, anything. We're in judgment of something else.
Right.
That's the problem.
That is a problem. So I'm just thinking, okay, probably I'm this lady. I'm coming from a culturally more dominant area. You know, clearly, Greek and Roman classical time was the pinnacle of Western civilization, right? It wasn't Israel. She's wealthier than Jesus. He's just an itinerant preacher who grew up as a carpenter. She's thinking that they're kind of an underclass, Jesus. But I'm going to go and beg him for help because I hear about these miracles he's doing. To be honest with you, I'd probably say, well, if that's the way he feels, I'm never going to come to him for help. No one likes being called hypocrites, like he called the Pharisees. He called them an evil generation. He called them a brood of vipers. He called them whitewashed tombs. He called them foxes. But we also don't like being called a dog, unless you pamper dogs like a couple of ladies in this room. Our pride kicks in and keeps us from asking for help again. We convince ourselves that we're special. We're worthy of God's grace. It's only when we are truly desperate that we're willing to do anything that it takes, including humbling ourselves. This woman's attitude in the face of Jesus's refusal, what's her attitude in the face of his refusal? Because that's the key to this passage. What is her attitude when he says what he says?
Agreement. Yes, Lord.
She completely agrees. She's not out
It-
there.
Uses the word Lord too.
Right.
She comes to Jesus empty-handed. She can make no claim on his attention, or his, and certainly not on his giving her special attention. She comes to Jesus empty-handed. She doesn't talk about her merit, that she deserves for him to come help her. She doesn't talk about her priority. I'm from the wealthier part of town. She doesn't talk about her standing, being of a more privileged culture than the Jews. She doesn't lobby for special treatment. But at the same time, she doesn't cut herself off from Jesus's miraculous power by thinking that she's too unworthy. She doesn't think she's too unworthy to receive anything at all. She accepts what he says, and she bows down as a beggar for grace. So then, the question for you is, imagine Jesus speaking these words to you. How would you respond? Jesus had this enormous magnetism. He had this enormous charisma that transcended borders. This lady had already heard across the border, cultural border, geographical border, across nationalities, across social classes. She knows that Jesus offers bread. She doesn't know yet how great that bread is, that even she's hoping beyond hope that he can free her daughter from this evil spirit. She doesn't even think that he could even offer eternal life and permanent freedom, both for her and her daughter. But just to receive this bread requires that we be willing to give our lives completely to him, humbly, bringing nothing with us to the table. Jesus' response to this woman assumes the special election of Israel, right? It doesn't bother us so much that the ancient Jews, starting with Abraham, were God's chosen people, right? We believe that God chose his people. That was his plan. He brings them out of slavery in Egypt. So those stories are 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. We accept the fact that Israel had a special place in God's plan of salvation history. Many early disciples could not rid themselves of prejudice against Gentiles. The ancient world was rife with prejudice. But guess what? The current world is rife with prejudice. In 1665, there was a missionary named Morgan Godwin, and he served churches, and the Wesleys did this too, by the way. John Wesley, founder of Methodism. This man served churches in Virginia and in Barbados. This is 1665, right? This is 100 years before the Revolutionary War. How did those areas make a living? Slaves. He served churches in Virginia and Barbados, but the slave owner Christians discouraged him converting slaves. You know what they said? They said, why such as they? What? Those black dogs to be made Christians? What? Shall they be like us? Okay, now, you're probably saying, I'm not like that. I've told you stories about myself, and I grew up in Jim Crow America. There were no blacks in my school. When I got on the bus, I was sitting in the front of the bus, and my maid was sitting in the back of the bus. When I went to the ice cream stand, there was a white water fountain and a colored water fountain. So I was very aware of a separation. And I can remember when they first started talking about, I think the legal term in Jim Crow South was that blacks should be offered a separate but equal school system, right? Well, guess what? They weren't equal except in sports, and we didn't have to play them, thankfully. Okay, so I grew up like that, but you all grew up like that too. In fact, we're all living in that even today. I remember, the Jews, there were a lot of wealthy Jews in my city, but they had to have their own separate country club because they weren't allowed in other country clubs. And in Rancho Santa Fe, you couldn't sell. I know in La Jolla they had, what do they call them? Red lines or something. You couldn't sell real estate to black people until like the 50s or something legally. Come on, you're supposed to be an expert on this, Bill. Didn't you? In Rancho Santa Fe, there was, but it's also, no, but it's the same about Asians. It was the same about Asians in San Diego at the early part of the 20th century. Jesus' response to this woman, but Jesus, we believe as Christians, that Jesus turns no one away who comes with humble faith. This woman is not bitter about the privilege that the Jews have of being first. She does not resent their share of God's blessing. She accepts her place, and she comes as everyone, that's me and you, every single one of us, have to come as a poor and needy sinner. We can't come to Jesus with our strengths. Oh, I'm a doctor. I'm well-educated. I'm wealthier. I'm not like those other people who are homeless. I'm not like these other people who have done bad things. I've been pretty good. Jesus sent no one away except those who were full of themselves, who brought other things to the table. God helps those who confess that they are needy and deserve nothing. Bernard of Clairvaux, I think I can't remember what century he was, maybe the 1300s. He said, it's the possession of a joyful and genuine humility that alone enables us to receive grace. Are you in the possession of a joyful and genuine humility? This woman is. And she shows a dogged determination for her daughter. She knows that she's unworthy, but that doesn't stop her from believing that her daughter is worth healing. Many of us, including me probably, would walk away from anyone who treated us with disrespect, like Jesus seems to have treated this woman. Because, get this, Satan uses pride to separate us from God and God's help.